Welcome to Critical Thinking Video 7, Building Strong Arguments. First of all, let's look at how to make a strong logical argument. Deductive reasoning is a basic form of valid reasoning. Deductive reasoning, or deduction, starts out with a general statement or hypothesis and examines the possibilities to reach a specific, logical conclusion. The scientific method uses deduction to test hypotheses and theories. Here we can see an example of deductive thinking. We have a major premise that all bachelors are unmarried men, and a minor premise that John is a bachelor. From this we can draw the conclusion that John is an unmarried man. To test the validity of an argument, we need to consider both validity and truth. Validity is the form of the argument, its consistency, ensuring that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Truth, on the other hand, is the substance of the argument and whether or not those premises are true. Let's look at some further examples and issues around argumentation. So, a sound argument must have a logical structure and true premises. So here is an example of valid logic and a sound argument. We have a major premise that all mammals are warm-blooded animals, and a minor premise that whales are mammals. Our conclusion is that therefore whales are warm-blooded animals. Because of the logical necessity of the conclusion, this argument is valid. And because the argument is valid and its premises are true, the argument is sound. So let's look at some more arguments to see if we can identify problems. So here we have an example of an argument that is invalid and unsound. This is because at least one premise is false and the conclusion does not follow. So we have a major premise that all mammals live underwater. This is a false premise, it is not true. Let's follow on to the minor premise which suggests everything that is underwater is wet. This premise is of course correct, although wetness is perhaps a perception. This argument gets further problematic when we look at the conclusion. We can see it simply does not follow, using these two premises to conclude that therefore all mammals are dry. As you can see, this is very confusing and none of the pieces add together. It's rare you will find something so wacky. This is an example of an invalid argument. Here the premises are true, but the conclusion is not a good one. It isn't drawn from the evidence presented. So we have a major premise that whales live underwater, and minor premise that whales are mammals. Both of these are true. The conclusion, however, doesn't make sense based on the evidence presented, concluding that therefore all mammals live underwater. This is a non sequitur. It literally does not follow. In my next example, I have valid logic but unsound premises. So as you can see, one premise is false, although the conclusion does follow from it. The major premise suggests that all mammals can fly. This of course is not true. However, let's follow the argument on. The minor premise is that whales are mammals. Now, the conclusion does follow. Indeed, if all mammals could fly, and whales were mammals, the conclusion would follow that whales could fly. Now in this case, of course whales are mammals, but the first major premise that all mammals can fly is untrue. Therefore, while the logic is valid, the evidence is unsound, and therefore this argument does not pass the test. It's also really important to state all the evidence and not leave anything unsaid. Here we have a minor premise that Spot is a dog, and a conclusion that suggests Spot is loyal. Now, there's a missing piece of evidence here. If I add in the major premise, this starts to make more sense. The major premise is that evidence shows dogs are loyal, and now the argument follows. In this case, the first premise was probably in your head already, but it wasn't written down. This is what we call a suppressed premise. However, this is poor practice for academic writing. You need to provide all of the evidence on the paper for the reader to draw conclusions. We've already looked at deductive thinking, but it's equally important to consider inductive thinking. Inductive reasoning is the opposite of deductive reasoning. With inductive reasoning, broad generalizations are drawn from specific observations. Basically, there's data, and conclusions are drawn from the data. This is inductive logic. We can only have finite evidence for the universal claim. The premises can never justify the conclusions we derive from them, but it is often the best method we have for reaching general conclusions from empirical evidence. So here we can say it played out on the slide. Both the major and the minor premises are based on observations or statements with an attempt to draw a universal claiming conclusion. Some will say this is not a valid argument, but at least can be made acceptable. Is it a weak argument or a strong argument? There's definitely much debate between disciplines in this area, particularly considering differences with qualitative and quantitative reasoning. It's also useful to consider the difference between a fact and a concept. A fact is a statement of truth and can be used to ascertain to some degree of truth. Facts are much more narrow in focus. On the other hand, a concept summarises or categorises. Concepts are more abstract and generalised. So let's look at an example. Gravity, as a force, is a concept. Gravity being dependent on the mass of two objects, however, is a fact. Let's look at another example. The sun rising from the east is a fact. However, it's a concept that the sun rises from the east because of the Earth's west to east rotation. Here you can see a concept can use another fact to be built. Now let's look how we build stronger arguments. For an argument to be strong, it must be conceptually strong. This means it's based on convincing and appropriate evidence. It must also be written in such a manner as to convey the argument to the reader. You can have a very strong argument, but if it's poorly written, it may not be convincing or valid to the reader. There are 5 common problems that you should try to avoid in your writing. The first is using lists of information. Here we can see an example in this video. This paragraph is made up of nothing but sentences drawn from the literature. There's lots of information here, but the paragraph doesn't really say anything about it. If anything, it's saying, this is what Fuller says, this is what Taylor and Treen say, this is what Green says, this is what Howden and Howden say. It doesn't really tell us what this means. Here's another example that's similar, the he said, she said. So once again, we've got lots of information from the literature. Yes, it's paraphrased, but it doesn't really tell us much about what this means or the consequences for it. The constant use of the author's name in the text also puts the emphasis on the author's name and not their idea. We can correct this by switching that focus and also providing more analysis and explanation of their points and how they link together. As such, we're beginning to draw significance from them. The previous video talked of the importance of taking a position, and here we can see an example paragraph with no position defined. This paragraph suggests 2 possible approaches for online education. There's a strong hint that the first is perhaps better than the second, but that position is never really defined. Very crudely, this could be fixed by just adding a sentence like this. Therefore, blended is arguably a more effective approach. This could be further strengthened by making this statement and point right at the beginning of the paragraph. Another issue with this example is that there's no evaluation. So it's presenting information from the literature, but not analysing what that means. Here we've got the same example, but with that analysis included. This is drawing inferences from the evidence that's much clearer to the reader as what you're trying to say. We can also combine this with the previous idea of taking a position. This is now a much stronger paragraph. Finally, There's always the issue of the right words but in the wrong order. We can see there's quite a dense paragraph of information here. It talks of the United Kingdom and the European Union and some of the impacts that the exit from the European Union will cause for the UK. However, the paragraph strangely defines some of the key terms like European Union and tariffs later, although it's already used those terms at the beginning of the paragraph. This is very confusing for the reader, and this paragraph would have been much stronger were both the European Union and tariffs defined at the beginning, therefore leading into the arguments that are presented at the beginning of the paragraph. This doesn't just happen within a paragraph. Right words, wrong order can appear across a whole essay, and so it's really important we provide our reader with the necessary evidence and arguments in the right order to demonstrate our points. Precision is also really important in academic writing, and you must be really precise with your meaning. Here we have a quote taken from a box of cereal. Research shows that when they eat a cereal like ours, kids are 9% more alert. But this draws many questions and indicates many problems with this statement. What research? What is a cereal like ours? What's a kid? This is a particularly subjective term, and you'll get a variety of answers depending on who you ask. Is a kid under 18? Or is it under 12? Or maybe it's ages 4 to 12, so that gap between baby and toddler and teenager. Any word like this definitely needs defining because it can be read very differently by different people. And then finally, it talks about kids being more alert, but how is this measured and how do they define alert? Stronger arguments are also strengthened with qualifiers. Qualifiers are words like some, most, all or few. Qualifiers must be accurate and consistent with our premises and conclusion. So here we have an example where it doesn't work. Our first premise states that some businessmen treat their workers badly, and our second that Malcolm is a businessman. The conclusion drawn from this is that Malcolm treats his workers badly. However, this is a partial qualifier and therefore not a valid deduction. The first major premise indicates that only some businessmen treat their workers badly. So, while Malcolm may be a businessman, he could fall into the category of those that do not treat their workers badly. And this is likely to be a much bigger category according to the major premise, identifying that only some businessmen treat their workers badly. Let's end on a checklist. When reviewing your own arguments, ask the following questions. Are my premises purely factual? Are there concepts about which I should ask? What do I mean by that? Have I made all my premises clear? Does my argument rely on any suppressed premises? I hope you found this video series useful, and congratulations for making it to the end. Good luck with your writing and research.